wall-to-wall coverage of the Trump immunity case at the U.S. Supreme Court. It does have huge ramifications, even bigger than President Trump, because it's about whether a president who is now a former president can be criminally charged for acts they took as president. And then there's a dividing line. Can you be charged for official acts, or do they have to be considered unofficial acts? And what is official and what is unofficial? Now, most acts, it's pretty easy to determine what's official and what's unofficial. But there are certainly areas when you're president of the United States where you are making decisions like with the CIA and others that are certainly right on the line between whether or not they're on the up and up completely under U.S. law, or is it something that we, again, allow presidents to do? What we argued at the ACLJ is, of course, there's never this full blanket immunity. It's not like the president can do whatever they want as president and claim that was an official act. We have criminal laws on the books that certainly apply. And one of the hypotheticals we'll get into later was, what if someone gave the president $1 million bribe to make them an ambassador? And my answer would be very simple. That is a crime. That is not an official act of the president because the crime came before the official act, and the crime outweighs the official act. So both the ambassador is compromised because looks like they didn't earn that position or didn't necessarily deserve that position. And at the same time, the $1 billion, if it really was considered a bribe. Now, you could get into some gray area there because a lot of major donors to campaigns do end up becoming ambassadors to some of the smaller countries. But I would say that's different than going to the president and giving him $1 billion. That's not a donation to a campaign before he is president of the United States. So there I'd say, no, that's not an official act, and thus you could be prosecuted for that once you were outside the presidency. And I think that most Americans would agree with that because you still then are, Logan, you're preserving what we need, which is presidential immunity for official acts, so that every drone strike that may have gone wrong but was still done in an official way with military telling you this is what we need to do, but it may have not gone perfect. We still need that kind of protection for presidents of the United States, whatever party they're part of. I did want to point out something that's just unique in this case because there are four main charges against President Trump that have been brought by Jack Smith in the case. Two of those charges, the Supreme Court heard arguments on last week to say that those charges were unconstitutional. And what that means is that at least 4 justices on the Supreme Court believed those charges were. It was brought by another January 6th defendant. So right now, during this oral argument, President Trump is being charged with a conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. Both, if the Fisher case throws out those obstruction charges, the conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding and the obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, Jack Smith is only left with a conspiracy to defraud the U.S. and conspiracy against rights, which are much weaker to take to the U.S. Supreme Court, which they'll have to consider post-oral argument. I mean, this is why, Logan, this case can get very interesting and also take much longer than maybe predicted when it comes to this immunity question, and here's why. I think if you've listened to the oral argument, what you've seen is justices don't believe in blanket immunity for the most part, but they also don't believe in no immunity at all. And I think what they're going to ask is that lower courts come in, unless they want to make that decision on their own, that lower courts need to come in, and these charges against President Trump, whether it's the 4 that survive or the 2, because the other 2 do not, and the lower courts need to determine through a trial what is an official act, okay? And then what's an official act that could be combined with a criminal act that would then negate its ability for the president to use that as a defense. So that'd be one. And the second, of course, would be is what are unofficial acts while you are president of the United States that could be criminal that you can then be prosecuted for after you're in office. So you see there, again, you've got to kind of splice this down to, and I think that ambassador question, it got right to it.
Let's say the official act is appointing ambassadors and the president appoints a particular individual to a country, but it's in exchange for a bribe. Somebody says, I'll give you $1 million if I'm made the ambassador to whatever. How do you analyze that?
That, I think, would fall under this court's discussion in Brewster, where the court held with respect to legislative acts that bribery is not an official act, which also matches the common law background. So the way that this court in Brewster kind of sliced at the joint was to say accepting the bribe and the agreement to sex the bribe are not official acts. That's private conduct.
Okay,
subsequent appointment would be essentially an unrestrictable power of this court that Congress couldn't directly regulate.
It cannot be someone donated a lot to a campaign, 6 months ago and suddenly became ambassador to Antigua. That is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about you coming in and saying, here's $1 billion, or I'll wire you $1 billion into your account if you make me an ambassador somewhere after. This is when you are president of the United States, because that's what we're talking about in this case. When can you be prosecuted for acts as president when you're no longer president? Not acts you may have done before you were president. Most presidential official acts on their own cannot be prosecuted once a president is out of office, even if it was an official act that went wrong. So like a war was declared or shots were fired and everything wasn't perfect and there were civilians harmed. But no, if the official way of going about that and initiating that combat or military decision was correct, which of course it would be inside the presidency, then you can't charge them for that. But if you got $1 million bribe before you launched that military act, and when we talk about the $1 million bribe, we're not talking about a donation to some C4. We're talking about like $1 million to the president's hand, like $1 billion or something like that. That criminal act would override the official act, and then likely, when you are a former president, could be prosecuted for that instance because the criminal act was so extreme.